sound. So with that, I think we'll go to Ashley.
Thanks, Jean, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ashley Nellis, and I'm excited to talk today about life sentences in America, which is a topic that the Sentencing Project has been committed to for the last number of years. This webinar is based on a report we produced this fall, which is a continuation of our efforts to document the number of people serving life sentences and to draw attention to the extraordinary rise in the use of life sentences nationwide and also in the federal system. As far as we know, this is the only systematic national data collection project on this population, and we hope that it will be used for assistance with advocacy in order to curb the use of what we view as a very extreme sentence. There are only, well, let me start by switching. I'm sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty here. So our role in examining life sentences is really about three broad categories of concern that we have. First, we're very concerned about the overall growth in the number of people serving life sentences, particularly at a time of sustained low crime rates. Lengthy sentences, a lot of the research shows, do very little to improve public safety, but long sentences are turning prisoners more and more so into geriatric centers where the cost of care is very high. And the practice of routinely locking up people for the rest of their lives, especially young people, which has gotten a lot of media attention and attention in the courts in the last number of years, ignores the potential for rehabilitation that we think many people in prison certainly have. So the whole trend in lengthier sentences, including life sentences, we feel is deeply counterproductive to public safety. Internationally, we're really out of step. America is known around the world for its sort of get-tough attitude toward people who commit crime. And it's a point of pride for lawmakers and those seeking public office. We often hear people who are candidates talking about how they're going to be even tougher than the last guy on offenders. And what ends up happening is that they're tougher on everybody, including those who are not a threat to public safety in the long term. Life sentences have become a bit of a symbol, a statement of our country's lock them up and throw away the key mentality. And this attitude has caused us to become the #1 jailer around the world, and also the world leader in the use of life sentences and life without parole. The broadened use of life without parole and life sentences, in our view, is a telling symbol of the transformation in corrections policy. Here in America, a 25-year sentence is standard for some first-time nonviolent offenses. In other countries, though, the longest sentence typically available is 25 years, and that's reserved for the most serious and the most dangerous crimes. And even those sentences typically allow parole review and the potential for release. A look at the sentences internationally shows that America is really far out of step with other countries. In the United Kingdom, for example, there's only 49 people serving such sentences compared to the more than 49,000 people in the United States. And despite these modest numbers, life without parole sentences were recently ruled unconstitutional in the United Kingdom. In a decision called the Vinter case, 3 prisoners' life sentences were reviewed for possible international human rights violations, and it was determined by a vote of 16-1 that whole life imprisonment without the possibility of a parole review was indeed a violation, and a result of 49 people serving in the UK are now eligible for resentencing. And finally, a third category of our concern for life sentences is that as policymakers begin to seriously review and reform other areas of the correctional population, lifers are frequently excluded from the discussion because of the misguided assumption that lifers are indeed the worst of the worst. Despite promising developments in other areas of criminal justice reform and some successes in depopulating prisons around the states, the lifer count continues to rise, is what our research shows. So before getting into the numbers, which I'll get into in just a minute, I'd just like to provide a little bit of history, more of which is in the report that accompanies this webinar. As far as life sentences with parole, these have always been part of our criminal justice structure, but they've been used with increasing frequency starting in about the 1970s. And the notion of whole life sentences gained in popularity starting with the ban on the death penalty that was in place from 1972 to 1976. Before this ban, only seven states allowed LWOP, and even though they were authorized, they were very rarely used. But beginning in 1972, the states scrambled to find an alternative to the death penalty and also used endorsement of it as a way to try to be more and more tough than the death penalty by broadening the allowable uses. Today, in 7 states in the federal government, the parole system has been completely abolished. So turning to our numbers here, as of 2012, 159,000 people were serving life sentences, which represents an 11.9 rise since our last data collection in 2008. Today we now know that 1 in 9 people in prison is serving a life sentence, and that 30% of the people serving life, or 50,000 of them, have no opportunity for parole. Also, we've noted in our latest data collection that the rate of growth for LWOP is steeper, has grown faster than that for life sentences with the possibility of parole. In fact, we've added over 10,000 people to life without parole census since 2008. Another notable sort of overall finding is that 10,000 people serving life sentences have been convicted of a nonviolent offense. Here's a little bit of a different look at the numbers that we found. For the adult lifers, about 3.5% or so are female and the rest are male. For juveniles, there's about 10,000 people serving life without parole or life with parole for crimes committed when they were under the age of 18. So we often hear the number of 2,500 for JLWOP, and those are the juveniles serving life without the possibility of parole. But there's an additional population that's serving life with the possibility of parole. And as many people know, the possibility of parole is many times a remote possibility. So total, there's really 10,000 juveniles serving life sentences or life without the possibility of parole. So looking at over the long term, we've started collecting data some years ago, and this graph demonstrates the overall rise that I mentioned earlier in life sentences. So we find that in 1984 there were just a mere 34,000 people serving life sentences, but this has quickly risen, and so in 2012 we have 159,000, which is a 370% increase since 1984. The states with the largest increase, California, unfortunately, gets the top place for many of these categorizations that look just at the state level data because of its unique position on corrections. But the largest increase goes to California, which almost 12% of an increase in lifers just in the last 4 years. Colorado also managed to increase its lifer population by 21%. Kansas by 23%, Nevada by 23%, and Washington State by 32%. Combined, more than 6,000 new LWOP sentences were added in these states alone. The states with the greatest number of lifers. So when we look at the whole nation as a whole, we want to know where are most of the lifers residing. There are life sentences possible in every state except for Alaska, but some states are more generous with their use of life sentences than others. And so we find that most of the states, most of the lifers are housed in these states and also the federal government, starting with Louisiana with about 3% and all the way up to California, which houses 25% of the nation's lifer population. At the state level, it's important to look at how many lifers are in their state prison population as well. And so nationally, we found that 10.6% of the people in prison are serving life sentences, but the states with the greatest percentage of lifers within their prison population are these below. California, again, with 30%, so 30% of the people in prison in California are serving a life sentence. Nevada, 22%, Massachusetts, New York, and Washington all have a relatively high percentage of their prison population is serving a life sentence. We also find, unsurprisingly, that there are severe racial disparities among the lifer population. Whenever we talk about criminal justice system and sentencing policy, we always need to talk about race. Research is clear that when we look further and further into the system, we find that racial disparity becomes more and more pronounced. Nationally, near half, about 47% of the lifer population is African American, and 2 out of 3 lifers is non-white. But in some states, the racial disparities are even more stark. Maryland, for instance, has the greatest percentage of lifers who are black among its lifer population. Blacks account for more than 75% of life sentence individuals in Maryland. In other states that are notable, mostly southern states, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, 2/3 to 3/4 of their lifer population is non-white. 16% additionally are Latino, with even higher percentages in states like California, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. And this next graph shows that just a sort of a sampling of the states, although no state really did very well on this score, that in these states, Maryland through Missouri at the bottom, more than half to 3/4 of their lifer population is non-white. So in this round of the data collection, we decided to also try to find out what the people serving life sentences had been convicted of. And what we discovered through our data collection and analysis was that the majority of people serving life sentences had been convicted of a homicide. For the LWOPs, about 80% of them had been convicted of a homicide. And for all lifers with and without parole, it was 64%. What's notable here, though, is that about 10,000 people serving life sentences have been convicted of a nonviolent offense, that is, drugs, property, or some other nonviolent crime. We also looked at the number of states that had a particularly high percentage of people serving life sentences for a non-homicide crime. Because the issue, partially because the issue of non-homicide life sentences has been, fairly important with the juveniles lately, and has also been raised in early years with the Harmelin Supreme Court case. In Harmelin, the court ruled that mandatory life without parole for a non-homicide, which in that case was a drug offense, was not in violation of the 8th Amendment. That was in 1991, but then in 2010, the court ruled that life without parole for a non-homicide committed by a person who was under the age of 18 at the time of their crime was considered to be a violation of the 8th Amendment. And so the ruling, the so-called Graham v. Florida ruling, affected about 200 juveniles of the 2,500 or so serving juvenile life without parole. And I raise that because while the ruling is really limited to juveniles, many legal analysts see this as a real turning point in the Supreme Court because it's one of the first times that it's taken a non-capital case and ruled that a particular class of offender is exempt from a particular sentence. So while the ruling is limited to juveniles, it raises again the question of whether it's ever appropriate to send individuals to life with no parole for non-homicide offenses. So in these states, Idaho, Washington, Alabama, Georgia, Kansas, Delaware, South Carolina, and Louisiana, over 30% of the people serving are there for a non-homicide crime, and that's a life without the possibility of parole. So we wanted to find out, without being able to be very concrete with our analysis at this point, we wanted to sort of speculate about what are some of the possible causes for the continued rise in life sentences. And we identified 5 or so that could possibly explain why we're continuing to see a rise in life sentences despite so many reforms in state prison and corrections policy around the country. So in the next few slides, I'll just go over some state-specific trends that demonstrate possible contributors, and these include the 5 that are listed on your screen. The first of which is the 3 strikes and habitual offender laws. So California is a great example of this, and I'll show you some longitudinal data that we received from California. So in certain states, the adoption of 3 strikes significantly expanded the number of individuals sentenced to life. As I mentioned earlier, California maintains 1/4 of the nation's lifer population, and 22% of the state's lifers are there as a direct result of a 3rd strike. Their law was enacted in 1994, and what makes their law particularly harsh is that upon the 3rd conviction, unlike other states, a 3rd offense could be any felony, not necessarily a serious or a violent one. So the law was passed with the promise that it would take people off the streets who are serious and violent offenders, but in reality, fewer than half of the individuals sentenced under the law actually had been convicted of a violent offense. 16% were actually there for a drug offense, and 30% were there for a property crime. So the passage of what's called Proposition 36 in 2012 changed the law, which is important, by narrowing the scope of eligible offenses. And because the reform was made retroactive, as many as 3,000 prisoners serving life sentences now qualify to be resentenced. So with that as sort of a backdrop, I'll show this is the trajectory of life sentences with the possibility of parole in California over time. It sort of dwarfs the life without parole, but that has continued to grow, as we showed in earlier slides. And then the prison population is beginning to decline because California is also undergoing changes to its overall prison population because of the Supreme Court ruling Brown v. Plata in 2011, which effectively ordered a massive reduction in the state's prison population in order to bring the state into compliance with the 8th Amendment. As a result, the drop in the prison population is really makes the proportion of life sentence inmates more pronounced. So California is an example of how 3 strikes has really driven some of the expansion of the prison population. Washington is another example. Washington, as you may know, was the first state in the nation to adopt a habitual offender law in 1993. But it wasn't as harsh, but it has made quite a bit of a dent in the lifer population. Life without parole is mandatory in 13 states and the federal government upon a 3rd strike. And in some states, the impact, like Washington, the impact of that law has been really profound. We can see from this data now that 2/3 of the people serving parole ineligible life sentences in Washington have been sentenced under the state's 3 strikes law. So Colorado demonstrates an example of where the state sentencing structure for habitual offenders that are in place have a broad range of years that are allowable. So it's a discretionary sentence that in Colorado, for instance, it allows trial judges to sentence sex offenders to an indeterminate sentence with a minimum of 1 day and a maximum of their natural life, and that sort of depends on how things go while they're in prison. And while many offenders do earn release, the purpose of treatment and earned privileges are suspended for people who are life sentenced, and so they're often put at the end of waiting lists or denied altogether because of their lifer status. So we can see when we look at longitudinal data for California, for the lifers, the life with parole, which I'll show in the next slide, is driven almost exclusively by the sex offenders, is really driving this overall life population. So when we look for Colorado at their crime of conviction, we find that over 80% of the people serving life sentences there are there for a sex-related offense. In Pennsylvania, I put this slide here as an example of a state, and like I said, there's a handful of states that include Pennsylvania where they've all abolished parole altogether. So they no longer have a parole system, and everyone who is sentenced to life will remain there for the rest of their lives. So Pennsylvania has had a 500% increase in life without parole since just 1980. And everyone there is serving a sentence for which they will die in prison if they have a life sentence. Pennsylvania is also a mandatory life without parole state for both first and second degree murder, which is unusual. They also have automatic transfer with no age minimum for juveniles. And so as a result of all three of those policies, Pennsylvania has more juveniles serving life without parole than anywhere else in the country and the world, more than 500 juveniles. And for a third of those, they're there under what's so-called felony murder rule, which is a second-degree murder. That means that they were there to commit, they were at the crime scene to commit a felony, a homicide occurred, but that wasn't the intention, and they were not involved in the homicide that did occur. The next sort of possible reason, New York is New York, which demonstrates an example of states where there have been really tremendous reforms for the overall prison population, but they haven't really penetrated the life sentence without parole population. So I'll show you some longitudinal data for New York. And New York has experienced almost a 20% decline in its prison population over the last 12 years. So this is their life with parole. This is their prison population. And the life with parole, I'll say, has also experienced a significant drop. They've dropped from 12,500 people serving life without parole, with parole rather, in 2000 to just over 10,000 people serving in 2012. But at the same time, and note that this axis is on the right side. That's why you can have people serving life without parole that goes beyond the actual prison population. The lifers are at 246 for life without parole, and that represents a 300% increase in the number of people serving life without parole in New York since 2000 rather. In Michigan, in New Jersey, these also show the same trends. Impressive drops in the prison population, but continued rise for lifers or the LWAP population. And the final state that I'll show is states that have an active death penalty work going on. So Texas obviously takes the cake for death sentences around the country, and death sentences had already started going down before LWAP was enacted in Texas, which it may be a surprise to you to learn actually was only enacted in Texas in 2007. That's because the state is so strongly in favor of the death penalty that there was a lot of resistance to enacting life without parole, and they were almost forced into it through some other things that were going on there. But the fact that the death sentences were already declined and the LWAP started to go up, it's really no guarantee that this would have continued had life without parole been enacted. In only the last 5 years, Texas has actually grown its life without parole population from 0 to 538, with an additional 8,500 people serving life with the possibility of parole. So before I open it up for what I hope will be a lively discussion and any questions that you might have, I just want to talk about why I think that this is a right time for reform and what sort of considerations we need to take into account before engaging in reform in particular states around the country. So there's a lot of excitement these days about recent comments made by the U.S. Attorney General Holder. He seems to be really serious about sentencing reform as a way to curb the ever-growing federal prison population. This all started in August, with his comments at an ABA event. And I'll just quote briefly here some of the things that he said. He said that he was calling on every member of the profession to question what is acceptable, what is accepted as truth, to challenge that which is unjust, and to break free of the tired status quo, and to take bold steps to reform and to strengthen America's criminal justice system in concrete and fundamental ways. He also said that it's time, in fact, that it's well past time to address persistent needs and unwarranted disparities by considering a fundamentally new approach. And he also said that our criminal justice system was in way too many ways broken. He acknowledged that way too many Americans go to too many prisons for far too long and for no truly good law enforcement reason. So that's really a profound and sort of radical statement from the Department of Justice. Even though he was speaking really about the federal system, this call for reform is supported by the tremendous successes in the states that we've already seen for a number of years. And there's been bipartisan support in the Congress very recently for serious reforms as well. But as we get, sort of positioned for all of the, the new criminal justice era that we might be on the precipice of, we can't afford to indulge in the temptation to exclude lifers from the conversation by saying either that they're too risky or that we want to continue to appear tough on crime, because in fact recidivism among life sentence prisoners who are granted parole is really quite low. In California, they've tracked lifers who were released and found that fewer than 1% were ever returned to prison over a long-term study of their follow-up activities. So the next, area for reform is looking at the carve-out opportunities. Where we've seen the most progress here is with the juveniles. In 2010, as I mentioned, was the Graham ruling, and then in 2012, Miller v. Alabama, the court ruled that juveniles cannot receive a mandatory life sentence without a meaningful opportunity of parole. At the legislative level, California's Proposition 36 is another instance of reforms that could make a large impact on the lifer population. As we consider work to end life without parole and life sentences, perhaps altogether, but beginning with life without parole, we need to be aware of the great successes that have been made in the death penalty abolition work. It's come such a long way. 6 states in the last 6 years have eliminated it altogether, and there are efforts underway in several other states. The death penalty has now been outlawed in 18 states. In addition to being outlawed, it's declining in its use across the nation, which really shows that as a practice, it's slowly falling out of favor. And I think that we can agree that the recent momentum in death penalty abolition and reform work can be attributed to the combined accomplishments of innocence movements, the cost, and the lengthy appeals process. But LWOP is often promoted as a humane alternative to the death penalty, despite the fact that it shares many of the same problems as the death penalty and may even have more problems because of its lack of prominence. Just the other day, 2 state representatives from Ohio went on record promoting the end to the death penalty in their state and advocated LWOP in its place. I'll just say a quote here from one of the state reps. He said, "It is time for Ohio to abolish this archaic punishment. The many flaws surrounding the death penalty show the punishment to be expensive, impractical, unjust, inhumane, and erroneous. It is time to evolve to a more just society and replace the death penalty with life without parole." In our mind, life without parole suffers from all of these same flaws and should not be used as a humane alternative to the death penalty. Finally, I just want to say that some of the work that we hope will be followed based on the present work that I talked about today is the some sort of census on the people serving the so-called virtual life. So those are sentences who aren't technically life or life without parole, but in the terms of years, they would guarantee that that person will spend the rest of their life in prison. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think here at the Sentencing Project and among our allies, we really feel like this is a critical moment to make sure that lifers are at the table and that they are under consideration for reform as we seek to roll back the tough on crime era policies. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Jean momentarily and leave you with just a few other reports that we've written over the years on lifers, and look forward to comments.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. We'll start the Q&A session now. If you'd like to submit your questions electronically, you can do that using the questions tool on the right-hand side of your screen. You can just type them in and submit them, and I'll get them. Otherwise, you can either use the microphone on your computer, or if you don't have one, you can call in to ask a question. If you want to do that, just raise your hand. There's a button in the shape of a hand on the control panel, and if you click that, I'll see that, and I'll go ahead and unmute you so you can speak. If you are calling in, just make sure that you haven't self-muted yourself, and also that if you're calling in using a phone, that you've entered the audio pin. The instructions on how to call in should be under audio in the control panel. If you just click telephone instead of mic and speakers, and it should guide you through that process. We already have a couple questions that some people have sent in. So the first question is, do you have any data on tendencies of prosecutors to seek LWOP instead of the death penalty in recent years, knowing it is cheaper and easier to get a life sentence in jurisdictions that heretofore always sought the death penalty?
I don't know of empirical data on that. That would be systematic and comprehensive, but I do know anecdotally and through talking with members of the courtroom work group in various jurisdictions that is obviously often used as a bargaining chip, but I don't know to the extent to which it's used nationally.
Okay. Here's another question. On the topic of causes, how does correctional enterprises and the privatization of facilities affect the progress of changing sentencing laws and the way that states' sentencing commissions decide if and when they will change their policies?
I'm not too much of an expert on privatization. I think that it's been around for a while, and about 10% of our prisons are privatized. Typically, people that are in private prisons are the lower level offenders, so that wouldn't include the lifer population. So I'm not sure there's a lot of incentive, but you may want to consult some of our other staff here who are more expert on privatization. But I'll just say briefly that people serving life sentences are typically not in private prisons.
Okay. We have another question, which is, my state is grappling with sex offender sentencing. Life sentences are viewed as a less expensive alternative to civil commitment of dangerous sex offenders. Any advice to offer there?
I think that it's tempting to want to get so-called dangerous people off the street, but I think that a really large public education campaign is really needed, particularly with sex offenders, because first of all, sex offenders covers a wide range of offenses, down from pornography all the way to rape, and so there's a lot that gets included in a sex offense, and the general assumption is that a sex offender is always a serial rapist, but that isn't true. And the other thing I think that really warrants a lot of public education at this point is the very serious research that's been done on people convicted of sex offenses that shows that, by and large, they're extremely amenable to treatment. And of course, there's going to be people who aren't eligible for release and are going to continue to be a threat to public safety. But when it comes to different offending types, sex offenders typically do very well when they're given a serious attempt at rehabilitation. And so either a civil commitment or a life sentence would really harm their chances for active and law-abiding participation in society.
Great. Another question. Does your study discuss the use of life or comparable sentences in the federal system?
We did include a sentence. We did include federal lifers in our data. And as you may or may not know, there is no parole in the federal system. So that was abolished in 1987. And as of the latest data collection, which was 2012 data, we were told by the Bureau of Prisons that there are about 4,000 people serving life without the possibility of parole in the federal system. There's an additional 1,300 serving life with the possibility of parole, and those people are old law, so they're before 1986.
Okay, great. One person sent in, I was surprised that Alaska and maybe other states was not included in your study because we don't have life sentences. Increasingly, we see 99 years with no parole as a sentencing disposition for both homicide and sex offender sentences.
Right. So this speaks to my final comment, which was about virtual lifers. Alaska does not technically have life or life without parole, but in our book they don't really get off the hook because they still have a fair number of people serving life sentence. I mean, serving terms of years that are very long. And so there's an actual discussion of that in the report, which I'm just glancing at now, but I don't see it in front of me. But yeah, so that talks to people serving these virtual life sentences where they're given either a stacked sentence, maybe 3 sentences of 30 years for 3 different crimes, and they serve them consecutively, or they're given a term of years that's 200 years. Connecticut has a lot of these, considering how small of a state it is and its relatively small prison population. They have a lot of people who aren't serving technically life sentences, but they have 299-year sentences or 250-year sentences.
Great. Another question that was sent in, what is truly being done to assist these lifers to obtain legal representation? And when these lifers are found to be innocent, what is being done to rehabilitate them back into society?
So I think this kind of speaks to the point or our concern about you know, the pitting of life without parole against the death penalty, because as death penalty abolitionists and advocates know, people that are convicted of crimes for which they get the death penalty are open to a number of specific appeals rights that are guaranteed only to people who are on death row as convicted of capital crimes. And so these are, you know, a death penalty appellate, a lawyer. They have a guaranteed right to appeal that doesn't run out, and they have all sorts of other rights because of the gravity of the sentence. And we certainly appreciate the gravity of the sentence and the permanency of the decision or the execution in that case. But for lifers, there's a relative paucity of rights afforded to people serving life sentences. It's really no different than any other non-death penalty crime. So you don't have the right to an attorney. You don't have the right to, you know, an inexhaustible appeals. And there's, you know, a certain timeline on the, you know, time after which you can't appeal your sentence anymore. So, you know, the legal representation for lifers is, you know, relatively poor. And that's not to say that there aren't serious concerns about legal representation for people serving death sentences, but there, in addition, you know, there aren't these constitutional protections for lifers. So, you know, there are certain organizations that certainly are trying to represent lifers, but the vast majority of them are dealing with the juveniles right now, to be perfectly honest. So.
Okay. We have another question about sentence length. Is there any data available on the average length of sentence that non-LWOP lifers serve before being released across different states where release is a possibility?
I think, you know, BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics, has done analysis of this, but I think it's been a while, and we might be able to talk offline if you want to brainstorm a little bit more about that, but I think that BJS might be the sole source that has looked at time to release for people in prison that are serving non-life sentences.
Okay. Here's another question. This person says, I work in the death penalty abolition movement and understand concerns about how promoting LWOP can be detrimental to other extreme sentencing reform. In my state, like many others, death penalty repeal would not be politically feasible without offering LWOP as a sentencing alternative. My question is how that conflict can be reconciled. Are you suggesting that LWOP should not be offered as an alternative to the death penalty whatsoever, or that we shouldn't be over-enthusiastic about promoting LWOP as a humane sentence?
I think, first of all, that it is an extremely difficult position to be in. And although the Sentencing Project doesn't, promote an opinion for or against the death penalty, I think it's pretty safe to say that every one of our staff vehemently opposes the death penalty, and myself included. I think that where the real issue is that there's been this expansion of life sentences without the possibility of parole that only sort of gets more and more desensitized to the public when the death penalty is compared to, is made in comparison to life without parole as much more harsh. And if you ask many lifers, a lot of them would say that there's very little difference, and that even some people serving life sentences would prefer the death penalty. So it's not that much of a difference between the two, and I think, from my view, that eliminating life without parole for all but the very obviously, the cases which would very obviously end up in the death penalty would be a first step, and certainly to not be over-enthusiastic about LWOP as a humane sentence.
Great. We have a couple questions about racial disparities as well as class disparities. The first question is, racial disparities were highlighted for LWOP. Would a greater commonality be the economic level or poverty? Are there any data on this available?
Well, certainly poverty and economic inequality are correlated with race, and there's a lot of overlap. We are very concerned about racial disparity, and we don't hesitate to say that it's about race and not about the relative inequality of certain classes. But that they're certainly you can't disentangle poverty from race, and so we asked about people's race, and that's the data that we received.
Okay. Another question regarding race. Life without parole is a serious concern, and we see the effects from your study that show the majority of lifers are African American and Hispanics. Do these findings also include the ethnic racial breakdown for juveniles as well?
Yes, if you're asking whether I have that data, I believe that I do. Yes, I do. So yes. Unless I'm not sure if you're asking that or if you're asking if the numbers I included include the juveniles, and they do. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was the question.
Okay. Yes.
One person says, those that support the death penalty and LWOP assert that it reduces crime, violent crime, because it gets the most dangerous people off the streets for a long period of time or life. How would you respond to people who make that argument?
I think that it is important to get the most dangerous people off the streets. All of us have very serious concerns about public safety, and we all want to do what is best to protect and to improve public safety. But when we look at the fact that there has been this explosion of people serving life without parole for crimes other than homicide, and for crimes as 10,000 of them are there for nonviolent crimes. I think that we can't really honestly say that all of the people serving life sentences or many of the people serving life sentences are there because they are the worst of the worst. I think we do have the worst of the worst in there, but I think they're just a small fraction of the people serving. And the job now is to refine our laws and our policies so that we are only capturing the worst of the worst and not broadening the net so that it captures people who really do reform their lives and deserve a second chance and want to be contributing to society and the economy rather than being just a burden on it.
Great. One person says, how can we as citizens go about changing laws when there is a monetary incentive for states to keep people in prison?
I think that it's difficult to change. It's difficult to change laws, and it's even more difficult to reverse laws that were put in place than it is to enact new laws. So a lot of the laws that we see and the reasons behind this continuing growth in lifer sentencing are because of policies that were put in place in the 1990s and beforehand in the 1980s about being especially tough on crime. I think what we're finding, what we're seeing in the newspapers every day now is that the states can't afford this this policy agenda. They can't afford to continue to incarcerate people at the rates that they're being incarcerated. We're at the federal level tomorrow in the Senate Judiciary. They're going to consider a bill, the Smarter Sentencing Act, which would have a direct impact on declining the federal prison population, which is currently overburdened. And so I think that there is, of course, a financial incentive in some places and by some lobbying groups to increase incarceration. But in this period of economic fiscal constraint, I think what's really winning the arguments today is to show how expensive it is to incarcerate more and more people for longer and longer periods.
Okay. Another person says, to what extent do you think recent European developments, such as the Vinter case, will impact LWOP reform in the U.S.?
That's a good question. Among colleagues in this area of work, many of us referred to that decision as, a real page turner because you would just never see that. Or, we've just never seen that sort of opinion in American criminal justice. Certainly not the Supreme Court, where in the Vinter opinion, for those who aren't familiar with it, the lawyers just went page by page, country by country, talking about how life sentences are just not used. They're used so excessively rarely that this number of 49 people is considered to be just outrageous. Whereas here in America we have 49,000 people and 159,000 people serving life with the possibility of parole. So I think it would be terrific if the American correction system would look at other countries. I think it's unusual. I think it's unusual in a lot of our systems. We just, maybe because we're just kind of a young country, we just always sort of say, oh, well, we're different, we don't need to do what other countries are doing, and so we're just going to sort of blaze our own trail here. But, we can see that what's really happening here is that we're very much out of step with the International Human Rights Network and also with international public safety procedures.
Okay. One person asks, is it true that LWOP only applies to murder and felony murder?
It depends. It depends on the state. So in some states, it is only applied to homicide or second-degree felony murder. In other states, it's used for a lot of other offenses as varied as drug offenses and kidnapping and property crimes. So it really depends on the state. So if there was a particular state, I'd be happy to talk with that person offline about what's going on there.
Okay. And one more question. A person asks, more on the conversation from earlier about the distinction between race and class. So this person is requesting, I guess, an extension of that conversation, or for you to expand on why it's so hard to disentangle race from poverty in our data.
Well, with our data, it's impossible to do because we didn't ask about income or poverty levels. So we asked, just sort of the data source for this study was departments of corrections, and we asked about the race, gender, and age of each person in their state system that was serving life or life without parole. And so we didn't have any information about their income or their poverty levels. But more broadly speaking, you know, it's difficult to disentangle them. A lot of times they're related because somebody who is a person of color is often and low income doesn't have access to the same counsel as somebody who has a higher income and is more likely to be white. So that's one reason why those two sort of go together to result in a harsher sentence or poorer representation.
Great. And we just have a couple minutes left. Here's another question. Based on your research, if we were able to outlaw LWOP, what would you recommend as an alternative sentence for those who commit the most serious crimes?
I think as an alternative, we certainly think, well, first off, we certainly think that there are certain people who it would never be a good idea to put them back out on the streets again. But I don't think that we can ever say that for somebody who goes into prison that we know at that time what they will be like in 5, 10, or 15 years. And so we certainly support sentences that allow and that promise a review after a certain term of years. In other countries, it's about 15 to 25 years before there's a review of the sentence, and I think that, we think that that's reasonable. There are certain people who will show after 15 years that they are nowhere near ready for release and that they need to go back and continue to work on themselves and come up for review again in a number of years. So, part of it is that we need to get comfortable again with the idea that 15 years in prison is a long time. There's this misinformation out there that people serving life get out after 7 years, and that's just simply not true. More and more, we have people in there for decades, and they have already reformed their lives, they have already done their amends, and they have already shown that they are responsible and trustworthy. And a parole board, a professional parole board, is best equipped to decide if that person is ready for release, and that would be dependent on an individualized review rather than these sentences that we've seen put in place that don't account for individual differences and for discretion.
Great. That is the last question, which is good because we're almost out of time. We will have the webinar slides as well as a recording of the webinar available, and we'll send you an email within the next week on how to access both of those things. So thank you, Ashley, so much for a great presentation, and thank you, everyone who participated in the webinar.